Wrestling fans ProWrestleMachine back with another member request. The Sheik. From the January 27, 2003 Observer Newsletter, Death of the Sheik, Royal Rumble Review. By Observer Staff. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 950091228. ISSN 10,839,593. January 27, 2003. Since the dawn of time, there have been tens of thousands of men who can call themselves professional wrestlers. Of them, not one was more hated. And because of the changing nature of the business, probably no one ever will be. There have been Sheiks too numerous to count in wrestling. But when you say the Sheik, everyone knows who you are talking about. Ed Farhat. The Sheik was one of both the most famous and infamous characters in the history of the business. He based being a heel on getting intense, riot causing heat, and the ability to draw huge crowds regularly and consistently in the same venue. He was the best there ever was. Farhat had been in rough shape regularly for the past 7+ years, and had worse in the past 2 years, several times being on death's door. His major health problems started after suffering a heart attack after a match in Japan in May of 1995. At another point in time, he spent considerable time in a coma that he wasn't expected to recover from. Down to just 121 pounds, he passed away on January 19th at about 3:25 a.m. at Sparrow Hospital in Lansing, Michigan, when he told his wife that it was time and asked to be taken off a respirator after his kidneys and liver had failed. His 2 sons were with his wife at the time. He was 76, but many considered him almost ageless. Long past the point he was even able to move in the ring, he was still a headliner. Legend has him born in Syria on June 7, 1926, but like everything else in his life, how old he was a mystery only known to his immediate family, and his mother even has him with a different birthday, and his relatives weren't sure of his age, although both his doctor's records and his mother's records concur with the 1926 birth date. He was one of 10 children of parents born in Lebanon. The Sheik himself was actually born and grew up in Lansing, Michigan. He played football at Michigan State University in the late 40s after lying about his age in 1943 and serving a few years in World War II. He began wrestling in 1950 as the Sheik of Araby for promoter Bert Ruby, to differentiate him from all the other Sheiks in wrestling. He became a top heel within a few years off television exposure on the Dumont Network, equivalent to the Fox network today, which carried a weekly pro wrestling show from Chicago in prime time in the early 50s, while wrestling out of Chicago, even then praying to Allah before every match. At the time, he had a hot-looking slave girl accompanying him, who he would abuse before the match to get the fans enraged, with the storyline that where he came from, women were property of the men. By the standards of the time, he gained a reputation in the ring as a good bump-taking heel, a part of his career that almost nobody remembers. By the late 50s, before he made his name by his wild out-of-the-ring antics, his bloodbaths, and taking Ernie Roth as his manager, he was working a lot in the middle of the cards. While there were always Sheiks in wrestling, and a lot more after he became a huge star, no other distinction was necessary. He was, and will always be, the Sheik. He was often called the original Sheik, even though that was far from the case. No connection was almost ever made locally to Edward Farhat of the Spartans in the 40s and the Sheik in the 60s and 70s. While wrestling was packing them in every Friday night at Cobo Hall for years, and making Sheik one of the wealthiest men in the business at the time, the media steered clear. It's probably just as well, since in those days it would have done some major damage to reveal that the Sheik was a former college football player, or worse, that he was actually from Lansing, and that he was the owner of the promotion. Francis Flezer, who was the father of his wife Joyce, was always publicly listed as the promoter in those years. Still, he was the subject of the 1985 documentary called I Like to Hurt People. When released, to show how little known he actually was outside the wrestling world, he was referred to in the movie as the Iron Sheik, a terrible movie filmed in the late 70s that showcased him when he was past his prime, and Cobo Hall was no drawing well. But he still got the kind of weekly heat that the best heels in wrestling history could only dream of. To show how enduring his legend was among wrestling fans, he was voted the greatest heel of all time some 15 years after his prime years in a Wrestling Observer newsletter readers' poll. As an enduring heat-getting heel with his level of drawing power, perhaps only Fred Blassie would even be comparable. Nobody will ever know, but it is quite possible that Sheik wrestled more matches as a pro wrestler than anyone in history, at least outside of Mexico. And if so, given the different industry as it pertains to scheduling and lifespan of a career and character, nobody is likely to ever top his mark. But to show how much of a cult business it was, despite the fact in many ways in the cities he headlined in, wrestling was actually far more popular when it comes to live attendance and TV viewership than it is today, The Detroit and Toronto media both only carried a short 7-paragraph AP-written obit story. Sheik would have to be considered the most consistent big regular draw in the storied history of wrestling in both cities. The WWE ignored his death as well. Pro Wrestling Noah acknowledged it on its weekend TV show, and All Japan is planning a ceremony to honor him at its next house show. The ESPN TV show Pardon the Interruption briefly mentioned his death, with Tony Kornheiser and Norman Chad fondly and positively reminiscing about him, including airing clips of him gnawing on an opponent. About 200 onlookers, all family and area friends, came to his funeral on January 21 at St. Mary's Church in Williamston, Michigan, just outside Lansing, where he had lived for as long as anyone can remember. With the exception of his forehead, he looked nothing like the Sheik due to the ravages of his illnesses. The priest at his service, no doubt from what would have been his wishes, only once referred to him as Edward. Early on, always referring to him as the Sheik. Yet outside of family, nobody connected with the wrestling industry was there. His frequent brushes with death in their own way mirrored his booking as pro wrestling's top heel in pro wrestling from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. Detroit and Toronto were two of pro wrestling's hotbeds at the time, and the booking was simple. Every other Saturday night in Detroit, and every other Sunday afternoon in Toronto, a babyface would try and hand the Sheik an elusive loss. The story was simple. The babyface would pound on the Sheik for a minute or two, often in a grudge match, jumping him while in the midst of his heat-getting ceremonial prayers. The Sheik would pull out a pencil, or some other foreign object, and carve up his opponent's forehead. The opponent would then usually get the pencil, which some may see as an inside joke today because he was the booker, but nobody was laughing in those days, and carve up the Sheik. Then they would do a fluke finish that would always leave the audiences infuriated. Today, the crowds would find it insulting. A constant stream of it would kill the business, and in those cities, eventually that did happen. But for years infuriated fans were so mad they bought tickets to the next show hoping to be there on the night they would see which babyface would reach superhero status by being the one who finally stopped the Sheik. Invariably, a referee would get knocked out. One time Sheik did a program with one of his favorite opponents, the great Pempero Firpo, Juan Kamanian, who started as a rare tag partner of Sheik and pushed as being just a wild. Sheik used to tape razor blades in those days to 4 fingers on his right hand, and was known for cutting refs and prelim wrestlers when they would do pull-aparts at the end of his matches. He also used the blades for self-protection in case any fans got to him. He'd slice them up immediately. It would go through non-decisions because of a ref going down and come back with 2 refs the next week. Once or twice, they even came back with 3 the week after that, but all ended up going down, leaving nobody to count as Firpo would get his visionary pinfall on Sheik. Finally, they did a match where there were 9 referees, but wouldn't you know it, Sheik still was able to use his object and cheat his way to getting a pinfall, leaving a half-dozen refs bloodied before it was over. Another standard finish was where the face, infuriated by all the blood he had lost in making his comeback, would get DQ'd for being caught with the object Sheik had brought in and used first, leading to the no DQ stip the next week, or for hitting the ref. Often this would lead to a top babyface being special ref, as fans figured no way Sheik can escape this one. But Sheik would usually carve up the babyface ref, ending the match without a winner, and move his feud over to the man who was ref of that match, who would go on television and vow revenge for what Sheik had done to his face. Sometimes the face would get counted out. One of Sheik's favorite finishes to infuriate the fans was the face pounding him in and out of the ring. When he'd finally get Sheik beaten, and this finish worked great with wrestlers who had a distinctive submission move. Perfect example would be Fritz von Erich and the Iron Claw, Firpo's similar El Garfio or Mark Lewin and the Sleeper. The match would end in a slugfest on the apron. The face would throw a haymaker, knocking Sheik through the ropes back into the ring. The face would get his hold on, and the ref would count, and the bell would ring. The fans rejoiced, thinking Sheik had finally submitted, only to learn from the ring announcer that instead, the face was counted out of the ring and Sheik was once again the winner. For weak challengers, or television jobbers, he used his famed camel clutch as the finisher. For the biggest name opponents, the finish was the dreaded fireball to the face, which had several purposes. It was usually sold as causing facial or eye damage. After the fireball, the face would leave the territory, and months later, he'd return, trying to garner revenge. With Firpo, for example, because Sheik liked him while he was gone, they first pretended he was blind from the fire. They would give updates on television and in the program every few weeks, even with photos of Firpo with his eyes all bandaged up. Eventually the word was he had regained his sight. By then fans were waiting for his return, knowing with his motivation, he'd be certain to garner the revenge for the frustrated Michigan wrestling fans. A bad challenger would get one shot. A good one would get maybe 3, and then it was time for a new babyface. Virtually every major name in wrestling in that era headlined against Sheik, and eventually fell to defeat. In the early years, Sheik used the camel on his trunks for the friction to light his fireball and is believed to have been the first wrestler to throw fire. In later years, he pioneered using a Bic lighter and flash paper. In many markets, the fire aspect became larger than life as he'd be billed as the fire-throwing Sheik. There were the all-time legends, from Andre the Giant, who despite the unbeaten legend to the contrary, did jobs for Sheik to finish their programs for the Fireball in both Detroit and Toronto in the mid-70s, to Bruno Sammartino, Buddy Rogers, Argentina Rocca, Harley Race, Jack Briscoe, Johnny Valentine, Ernie Ladd, Dick the Bruiser, Von Erich, Dusty Rhodes, Fred Blassie, Wild Bull Curry, Haystacks Calhoun, Abdullah the Butcher, Defunct, Spiros Arion, the Big Saka, a young Seiji Sakaguchi, Giant Baba, Stan Stasiak, Chief J. Strongbow, and even a young Randy Savage and Gino Hernandez all fell to the Sheik. There were a bevy of longtime stars and local legends like Firpo Lewin, Mighty Igor, Lord Althal Layton, Whipper Billy Watson, Dominic DiNucci, Killer Tim Brooks, Sweet Daddy Siki, Flying Fred Curry, Thunderbolt Patterson, Bearcat Wright, George the Animal Steel, Billy Red Lyons, Big Bill Miller, Tex McKenzie, Bulldog Don Kent, Tony Marino, Angelo Mosca, Dick Bulldog Brower, Luis Arriba Martinez, and Tiger Jeet Singh. And there were even some guys who Sheik drew big money with who never amounted to much anywhere else, such as the Magnificent Zulu, Ron Pope, Hank James, and Carlos Roca. In Detroit, where Sheik would lose via DQ on occasion, the big goal was getting the 3 count from him and winning the U.S. title. In Toronto, the goal was beating the Sheik, as during his best drawing years there, he didn't use the U.S. belt he was always photographed with in the wrestling magazines for whatever reason, probably because they weren't part of the U.S., although the city previously had its own U.S. title in the 60s, dominated by Valentine. Toronto was the unbeaten streak gimmick. The city, with a rich wrestling history and an outstanding promoter in Frank Tunney, had fallen off a bit. Since a very simple formula in Detroit was producing huge business, the idea was just to try and duplicate what had already proven to work. Sheik worked main events twice a month from February 1969 through October 1974 at Maple Leaf Gardens, or about 140 shows unbeaten against the biggest name talent in the world, before losing via DQ to Tiger Jeet Singh. Through his final major match in Toronto in the summer of 1977, he only lost twice cleanly, a November 19, 1976 match against Thunderbolt Patterson, and a February 6, 1977 match against Brazil. After the loss to Singh, the idea was Sheik would get his heat back right away by introducing the U.S. title belt to Maple Leaf Gardens on the next show and making it the most important thing in the promotion, so fans were all wound up, this time needing to see him pinned. It worked for a while, but Singh's win and introduction of the title was done because business was starting to fall. It didn't stop the decline, as the act had started to run its course. Some point to the January 1974 win over Andre as the end of the golden period, with the idea that once Sheik beat Andre in a death match, fans stopped believing that anyone was going to beat him. Others who point to that same match to when his box office magic started to fade, say it was because Sheik was nearly 50 and looked every bit of it. Although he was feared as a monster and remembered as larger than life, Sheik was legitimately only about 5'9.5" and 235 pounds. Andre at this point was in his physical prime, and since Sheik didn't bump, some say the matchup exposed the business. Sheik had beaten many huge young men in the past, while business only got stronger. His most famous foe of all was fellow Michigan native Bobo Brazil. Brazil sold out more shows in Detroit with Sheik than any wrestler alive. After taking control of the promotion, Sheik's reign of horror and money began on February 6, 1965 at Cobo Arena when he pinned Valentine to win the U.S. title. After Brazil was screw-jobbed out of victories for years, his May 29, 1971 win over Sheik at Cobo Hall was no doubt the most famous wrestling match in the history of that city, and probably the biggest pop ever. Fans had waited more than 6 years for the moment when Special Ref Layton, a frequent screw-job loser to the Sheik himself, hit the mat for the 3rd time after Brazil cracked Sheik with his famed Coco Butt to win the U.S. title. As strange as this sounds today, with the exception of the end of the nearly 8-year reign of Sammartino as WWF champion and the ascension of Pedro Morales, this would have been the biggest wrestling news story of that year in the U.S. It is very likely that no two men in wrestling history wrestled each other as many times as Brazil and Sheik, and it was almost eerie that Sheik passed away just 1 day shy of the 5th anniversary of the death of his most famous rival, in nearby St. Joseph, Michigan, due to complications from a stroke at the age of 74. Based on the legend of their feud in Michigan, particularly after the match where Brazil pinned him. The two worked against each other all over the world, and their feud spanned nearly 40 years in Michigan. People were stunned, remembered Brian Book Candace, who did the programs for the Cobo Hall shows at the time and is now looking at reviving the old Wrestling Review magazine, a popular title at that time, as a newsstand mag to focus on wrestling from that era. They couldn't believe somebody had finally beaten the Sheik. Leighton was the referee. It was a chain match and Leighton fast counted the fall. Sheik attacked Leighton after the match. We figured he must be going away for him to lose. The fans, they just couldn't believe it. There had been so many close calls. They were on their feet cheering for Bobo. Then all the wrestlers came out and put Bobo on their shoulders and carried him around the ring. Sheik and Dick the Bruiser were already the top-drawing heels in a territory run by Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle, which encompassed Detroit and Indianapolis as its main cities in the early 60s. When Barnett and Doyle left to open up a national promotion in Australia, they sold the rights to Detroit to Sheik for $50,000. The terms were $10,000 down and $1,000 per month for the next 40 months to obtain the NWA territorial rights to the city and state, a multi-year exclusive lease with Cobo Hall, and a local television contract that had 3 more years. Unlike most deals of those sort in wrestling, where the money agreed upon long-term never ended up coming through, Sheik paid every penny and was always on time. Of course, building the cities around himself, he was drawing huge money almost everywhere he went. His booking formula was simple. Tease the audience weekly that something very important was going to happen, and never deliver, with the idea that they'd only want it more. And for years, it worked. By today's standards, the Sheik in his heyday would have been considered a terrible worker, as he was nearly 40 when he exploded as the top heel draw in the business. Most of his matches usually ranged from 3 to 6 minutes, and there was no wrestling involved. Legend has it that all of his matches were like that, but even into the mid-70s, he did some longer matches in Detroit, doing about 6 one-hour draws over the years, although with the time being shaved they were probably closer to 40 to 45 minutes, a few with the even older Luis Martinez. Those who were there said the matches would be considered unwatchable by today's standards. There was a lot of what today would be considered terrible brawling. But the blood was a novelty, as it wasn't done on the undercard. He bled in almost every main event, as did his opponent. Many of the leading promoters in wrestling hated the success of the Detroit promotion because they felt it was too violent and would ultimately hurt the business. But there also can be no denying the results for many years. While the legend that Sheik sold out Cobo Hall weekly for years is exaggerated, a crowd of 7,000 in those days would have been considered a disappointing house. Sellouts were plentiful, even during the 1971 to 1974 period when the Cobo shows would be battling head-to-head every other Saturday night with shows at the Olympia, now Joe Louis Arena, put on by Dick the Bruiser's crew in Indianapolis. The Detroit wrestling war stemmed from a battle over who owned the rights to Cincinnati. Bruiser, feeling Sheik had come into his territory, made a deal and got his TV in Detroit and followed up promoting regular shows. In Toronto, where he didn't own the promotion, but booked his main event programs, he frequently drew crowds of around 15,000. A 1971 match against Singh drew in excess of 18,000 fans, still the largest crowd ever to watch wrestling at Maple Leaf Gardens. During the 4-year period from 1970 through 1973, the crowds for the biweekly shows never dropped below 10,000, a record that few men, if any in history, can even approach in a market run so often. If Sheik wasn't on the bill, which was rare, and something he'd do just to prove that it was he who was drawing the money, they would do about 1/3 that, which was a similar occurrence in Detroit, such as the period Sheik missed some shows due to abdominal surgery or when he'd miss a date due to a Japan tour. That's why nobody beat the Sheik in Toronto. In hindsight, even more astounding because of the time period, is that for years in Toronto, he never wrestled more than 8 minutes in a main event for years until going nearly 30 minutes once in a match with Brazil, which sounds scary. Some of his biggest gates included drawing 17,000 in 1970 against Watson, the aging local hero in one of his final big matches, another 17,000 for a summer outdoor show in 1971 when challenging Dory Funk for the NWA title, and consecutive crowds of 18,000 and 16,000 for a pair of 1973-74 matches with Andre. By 1975, the gig was starting to be up, as crowds fell below 8,500 regularly. He was gone for a few months in early 1976 with WWF champion Sammartino being used as the top draw, but even with Toronto's huge Italian population and the Sammartino mystique, which was probably at an all-time high, he wasn't able to turn around the falling business and actually was drawing less than Sheik. Promoter Frank Tunney then went back to Sheik as the top star. His final match for Tunney came on July 10, 1977, when he challenged Harley Race for the NWA title outdoors at Exhibition Stadium. He was one of the biggest stars in the world at the time, and whether he appeared in the territory or not, virtually every wrestling fan knew the name of the Sheik. It was from a combination of legend from other fans as this devil incarnate, or from the bloody cover photos and stories about this hated man who never got his comeuppance in the wrestling magazines. By this time, he was never appearing in major population centers like New York, San Francisco or Chicago, or wrestling hotbeds like Florida and Texas, although he appeared at various points in all those cities. Many promoters steered clear of using him because of the fear of a lawsuit, such as the famous one that happened in Los Angeles after he missed with a fireball and hit a woman in the front row. But he would run away in the most hated wrestler polls in the national magazines to the point where the battle was always for second place. In St. Louis, Sam Mushnick brought him in twice after he became an international star. He had appeared as a prelim wrestler in the late 50s and early 60s, and after nearly starting a riot with his brawling outside the ring and doing a match with Pat O'Connor that lasted less than 30 seconds, Mushnick went very public after the show, used him one more time as per his earlier commitment, and said he was never welcome back. In most cases, that would be an angle alert, but Mushnick was deadly serious. Jim Barnett in Atlanta echoed a similar opinion, saying that he always liked Sheik personally and thought highly of his wife, Joyce, who handled all his business affairs because, even away from the arena, Sheik never spoke in public. I used him a few times in Atlanta and he was a big hit, Barnett recalled about the mid-70s, after he came back from Australia. The problem was I couldn't control him. I was always afraid I'd get a lawsuit. We were selling out week after week, even without him, so it wasn't worth the risk. He also didn't like to lose, and I never liked to have a guy on top who wouldn't lose because it could really screw up your area. He was legitimately banned in New York State by the Athletic Commission for life in early 1969 after causing a riot, which only made him more mythical in the wrestling magazines based out of that city. He had just come off 3 main events in Madison Square Garden with WWF champion Sammartino. It was the typical program until the finish. Sheik won the first match via countout in 12:16 before 10,443 fans on October 21, 1968. Sammartino won the second match on November 18, 1968, via DQ in 6:14 before 11,122. Sammartino won the third match on December 9, 1968, which would normally be the clean pinfall. Instead, the best they could get was a match stopped for blood in 9:58 before 10,943. The crowds were at that point in time the normal levels for a Sammartino main event. In San Francisco, even though he rarely worked the territory, when he was brought in as a national star to face Ray Stevens, who was the area's top heel who had become a huge draw by saying how much he hated San Francisco, the crowd was 100% pro Stevens in the building, even though Sheik was brought in as a man as wild as Stevens to tame him. Unlike almost all of the great drawing heels of that or this era, there was an underlying coolness about them which made them monster babyfaces when they turned. With Sheik, the few attempts at turning him lasted very short, because it was clear that while the people popped huge for him once as a novelty face to tame a new brash heel, he simply couldn't be effective more than a few weeks in that role. And at his peak, people were in fear of him and nobody considered him cool. In those times, Sheik's simple act drew incredible heat everywhere. Sure, being an Arabian was a lot of it, but there were a million Sheik imitators, many of whom did the camel clutch and all of whom did the easy heat gimmick of praying to Allah before their matches, and most of which copied his fire throwing. Only Allah knows how many wrestlers after Sheik caught fire claimed to be from the Middle East. A few of whom, like Sheik Adnan El-Kaisi and the Iron Sheik, even were. But nobody ever came close to drawing like he did. Even stranger by today's standards, he did this without ever saying a word. And unless you were a family friend, he kept that up until the day he died. Because of that, he was unlike virtually every major drawing card in modern history, who got over either because of great athletic skills, or more often, because of a gift of gab and being great self-promoters. Sheik, in his own way, was a great self-promoter, because he never broke character in the public eye, but because of it, less is known about him than virtually any wrestler of similar stature. Although he only appeared a handful of times in San Francisco, he was one of the best-known wrestlers in Northern California due to a 1962 angle on live primetime television where he attacked TV sponsor Jim Wesson and ate his tie, an angle wrestling fans in the area talked about for nearly 30 years. When he'd come into a new territory, he'd eat the wrestling program, usually the page with a photo of his opponent, while his manager would laugh maniacally. Crazy heels in pro wrestling were also a dime a dozen, but none were ever anywhere near as believable or effective. and none took their gimmicks as seriously. Even Abdullah the Butcher and Mark Lewin, in his maniac days, would do the no-talking gimmick, but if you saw them at the airport, they wouldn't work their gimmick. Sheik was different, as he always traveled with his wife, and thus talked to nobody except family. Even his grandchildren called him Sheik, and not Ed. When those in wrestling would call his home to book him for an outside date, and ask for Ed after his namesake's son had moved out, the response always was, even when he picked up the phone, "There is nobody named Ed living here." Few people involved in modern wrestling understand the thought process of Sabu, who is his real-life nephew. Terry Brunk, Sabu's mother, Eva Brunk, is Sheik's sister. But if you understand the Sheik, it becomes much clearer. Although he didn't copy the Sheik act to a T, probably his most successful imitator was his longtime friend Larry Shreve, who grew up across the Canadian border in Windsor, on when Sheik was on top. Shreve took a lot of Sheik's mannerisms, the uncontrollable personality, the foreign objects, the turban, the mysterious nature of never talking and the nightly bloodbaths, the not doing jobs hardly ever, and created the persona of the mad man from the Sudan, Abdullah the Butcher. Butcher took the act to Japan first, and because of that, became a bigger star than Sheik when the two were tag team partners regularly there. His most famous match ever in Japan was the December 15, 1977 Tokyo Budokan Hall finals of the first ever real World Tag League tournament with Sheik and Butcher versus the Funks. It was a match so monumental that it not only made the tournament a fixture that has lasted 26 years, but made the Funks the biggest foreign babyfaces ever in Japan up to that point in time. It was a simple but superheated story. It was the pencil to the biceps of Terry, who bled so badly that the girls cried and he was carted out of the match. Story had to continue valiantly alone. Suddenly, with his arm in a sling, Terry returned and cleaned house. As it turned out, the finish was a screw job, as the ref got knocked down and the Funks won by a DQ, so Sheik still didn't do the job in the end, and probably never did one for Funk in Japan clean until he was 67 years old. During his original big run, Ernie Roth, who later became more famous in the WWF as the Grand Wizard of Wrestling, was his mouthpiece as the turban-clad Arabian, Abdullah Farouk. After Wizard moved east to work for Vince McMahon Sr., he continued for a while going to the big shows in Detroit and Toronto. But since Sheik had his own territory to work, he was replaced by his second manager, the Palestinian brain, Eddie Creechman. Many point to the beginning of his downfall starting when Creechman started handling his mic work. Creechman was far more cartoonish as an over-the-top yeller and screamer. Later, as the territory went down and Creechman left for Montreal, Sheik used numerous different local wrestlers as managers at the house shows, and usually had Ripper Collins do the talking for him. Abdullah Farouk was both sinister with an underlying comedic edge, and had a gift of gab where he didn't have to scream to get his point across, and was generally considered, along with Bobby Heenan, the best manager of that era. But Sheik had good years during the early Creechman period. Few heels in wrestling, in fact none of whom come to mind, ever did 7 or 8 year unbeaten streaks in the same building. When he became a top draw, it was virtually impossible, even out of the territory, to get him to do the job. In 1972, when he was brought into the WWF for the last time, working a Boston program against champion Pedro Morales, since he wasn't allowed in New York, the best they could get out of him was Sheik and Morales brawling on the apron, and Sheik punching Morales into the ring for a count-out loss, making him likely the only challenger during the Morales title run that didn't lose decisively in the final meeting. He did do some high-profile jobs while working in Japan, however. Therein lied the problem with Sheik, who was also very rare among wrestlers of that era, both because he always brought wife Joyce with him on every trip because, among other reasons, someone needed to talk. While he was a great draw, fans were usually left unfulfilled as the local babyface never got full revenge. In Los Angeles, in a lengthy heated program with Blassie, who by this point was the city's top babyface, they came up with a unique solution, which led to the July 29, 1970 match, which legitimately turned away thousands at the Olympic Auditorium and changed cage matches forever. After a cage match a few weeks earlier ended when Farouk threw iodine in Blassie's eyes, Blassie came up with what would be known for a decade in that part of the country as the Blassie cage. Different from prior cage matches, the match wasn't to end with a pinfall, but with the first man who could climb over the top of the cage to the floor. This allowed Blassie to get his big win, even though Sheik never did the pinfall. This also is where the over-the-top cage match rules are believed to have been started, allowing cage match blow-offs without pinfalls for the next 3+ decades. It was also at that time that he introduced yet another gimmick, bringing a live snake to the ring with him to scare fans and freak out opponents. The snake would be brought to the head of his opponent, and Sheik, using the blade taped to his fingers, would at the same moment sliced the foe's head, making people think the snake had chewed him up. But ultimately, the world changed. The Sheik got older and the audience started seeing through him. He also, in Detroit, used much of the same crew, so besides the aging Sheik, most of his opponents and most of the wrestlers pushed strongly were also well past their prime. The work rate was horrible compared to the rest of the country, and as WTCG came into Michigan and Ohio, the fans started seeing a faster style of wrestling. Even before the cable exposure, when business started falling off, Sheik would advertise all sorts of big names being there to draw a house. It seemed like 6 to 10 wrestlers per show were being false advertised. Sheik actually was doing this even during the glory years, but he was so hot on top that he could get away with it. But it got to the point where Bruno Sammartino would be advertised against the Sheik, and it would end up being Martinez, and people stopped believing any major star would come. Detroit was dying, blamed on the no-shows and 10 years of doing the same act. By the mid-70s, Toronto died as well, faltering in 1975 and being dead by 1977 when Sheik and Tunney split. Tunney wasn't able to turn his fortunes around, despite bringing in big-name talent for every show, for a couple of years. It wasn't until October 22, 1978, that things got hot again as a 3-show program with Ric Flair vs. Ricky Steamboat drew more than 10,000 fans per show. They even segued Sheik's U.S. title, which he never lost in Toronto when Tunney made the change, to the Crockett version. In Detroit by this time, most of the big names steered clear because they couldn't draw there. And there was no money to be made, which led to the quality of wrestlers declining except for the crew that lived in the area and had been around forever. Sheik even went babyface for a while. Like so many others before him and after him, he couldn't recognize when it was time to make a change, and ended up losing much of the money he earned in his glory years by trying to implement a formula that in his mind was gold, and was, until its time ran out. Sheik's promotion closed its doors at the end of 1980, with Sheik still as U.S. champion, a belt he would continue to wear on independent shows and on Japanese tours for the rest of his career. In hindsight, the beginning of the end in Detroit mirrored that of Montreal, where a 1972 match between Sheik and Johnny Rougeau sold out Jerry Park with 26,000 fans, which is still the city's all-time attendance record. Roller derby and is eerily similar to the current scene. There was a huge boom period with 2 competing promotions, pulling out all the stops because the war was so heated. Eventually one of the companies started losing the war. In the case of Detroit, Sheik's side was always in command. First off, as the NWA members, in the early days of the war the various NWA promotions would send them talent to put on incredible undercards. Still, Bruiser was a huge draw himself in Detroit, as the main heel in the city, occupying the role Sheik held a decade earlier. He still had a mainstream sports name because of his famous bar brawl, which ended up with Bruiser in jail and also getting the feud unheard of publicity by the standards of that time, and match with Lions star Alex Karras. Bruiser, even bringing in names like Sammartino, was never able to outdraw Sheik, but he was doing healthy numbers. It was the rule rather than the exception at first when Sheik would pack 10,000 into Cobo, and Bruiser would draw another 5,000 at the Olympia. The war among management was among the more bitter of its era, but the wrestlers at the time from both companies used to sneak out and hang out together. Still, because of the promotional war, many NWA promoters at the time shied away from using Indianapolis talent such as Bruiser, Wilbur Snyder, Blackjack Lanza, and Bobby Heenan. Sheik's numbers stayed strong throughout the war. Only once, when Bruiser promoted a cage match with he and Crusher against the Blackjacks, Lanza and Mulligan, and vowed if his team didn't win, that he'd never wrestle in Detroit again. At a time when people believed in stipulations, he outdrew Sheik head-to-head by putting 10,000 at the Olympia. Eventually, without access to as much talent as a non-NWA member, had to recycle the same talent and ran out of fresh matchups, and crowds dwindled down below 2,000. Losing significant money at this point, Bruiser made peace, pulling out of Detroit, and agreeing to promote the elusive dream matches that area fans talked about and figured they would never see. It was only natural for the elusive Sheik vs. Bruiser program to take center stage, but the whole interpromotional series was a 3-show series, all drawing turn-away crowds. The first match was put at the Olympia, to give the illusion Bruiser was still in business, because it was the larger building. Because it was in a terrible part of town, many of the Cobo regulars didn't attend, and while it drew well, it didn't sell out. The rematches were moved back to Cobo, with the series ending with Sheik getting the pinfall at the end from Bruiser. This must have been hard medicine to take, because Bruiser hated doing jobs unless it was St. Louis, where there was no option. The program was over, and it wasn't long after that, with no competition and having slayed Bruiser, that crowds started falling off quickly. Sheik somewhat returned the favor in Indianapolis, in that he worked for Bruiser and drew huge houses with him, but since he won the war, he would never put Bruiser over clean. After the big promotion closed up in 1980, Sheik continued to run shows on a much smaller scale, most notably one of the campiest wrestling shows of its era. By this point, Sheik had gotten involved in booking some country music acts, since there's no money to be made in wrestling. He attempted to use the wrestling formula to get them TV exposure, and thus was born a unique TV show, Big Time Wrestling and Big Time Country, in the early 80s. It consisted of low-rent wrestling matches featuring a few names from the glory days long past their prime, combined with inexperienced former jobbers in the main promotion, many of whom lived in Sheik's basement, which was nicknamed the Holiday Inn for struggling wrestlers. And it also featured the few, as in very few, country music acts he had under contract performing. Needless to say, this didn't last very long either. Still, he stuck around long enough to make his mark on the 90s wrestling scene, through his training of his nephew, Sabu, and a local kid named Rob Schitkowski, who later became Rob Van Dam, and having a hand in breaking in Scott Steiner. He was also the first promoter to use Randy Poffo, and the first major star to feud with him after he gave him his first push as Randy Savage. After Tunney stopped using the Sheik, he worked for outlaw promoter David McKigney, and Sheik was the most interesting chapter in the book Drawing Heat, about wrestling in the summer of 1982 on that small circuit. Sheik would wrestle all over Ontario before small crowds on money-losing shows looking for his own nightly fountain of youth, while Tunney's working agreement with Jim Crockett Jr. brought him the Mid-Atlantic stars combined with former local football star Mosca that were back routinely drawing 10,000 fans to Maple Leaf Gardens. Detroit didn't rebound until the mid-80s behind Hulk Hogan when the WWF went national. Still, with a lot of internal opposition because of Sheik's reputation and more than a decade after he had drawn his last big house in the city, Jim Crockett Promotions booked him for his last big match in that city. Crockett, for whatever reason, couldn't draw in Detroit after debuting in 1987 with a spectacular show and huge house for the Ron Garvin title win over Ric Flair. Kevin Sullivan, who was around as a fan during Sheik's heyday and worked with him a lot in Hawaii, heard all the stories of Uat Sheik in Detroit and suggested using Sheik on the show. While everyone in the company called the performance, as Sheik couldn't move at all by this time, an embarrassment, the normal Crockett crowd of 1,500 in Detroit was more than 7,000 on July 31, 1988 for Dusty Rhodes and Sheik versus Dick Murdoch and Sullivan, and everyone knew it was Sheik who drew the house. The Gore Fest went 3:55 with all four juicing at the bell and Dusty, pinning Sullivan. Sheik pulled out an object and went after Rhodes. In a double surprise, Murdoch then turned on Sullivan to help Rhodes. This was to set up the return of the Texas Outlaws, Rhodes and Murdoch, versus Sheik and Sullivan on September 4, 1988. Sheik demanded $10,000 to work the return a few days before the show. It was an unheard of price in those days for a one-shot for a house show, and was turned down. He no-showed the card, which drew 7,500. Flair versus Lex Luger was the main event, and it was years before Crockett or WCW drew in that city again. His last appearance on a show in Detroit was October 29, 1995, at the WCW Halloween Havoc pay-per-view. This was several months after the heart attack that ended his career. He was controversial to the end, seconding Sabu in a prelim match against Mr. J.L., Jerry Lynn under a mask. Sheik, going into business for himself, threw a fireball after the match at J.L., which freaked out both production people and the building who weren't aware and hadn't approved of it, and WCW never considered using him again. At one time Sheik, who was still a big draw in Japan, enlisted the help of the other major stars in that company, Abdullah and the Funks, to rebuild the city that was drawing less than 2,000 per show. They did their usual bloodbaths that were wilder than usual since Abdullah and the Funks were a lot better than Sheik's usual opponents in those days. They worked a lengthy program with nobody making much money, but the houses slowly built up. Finally they got the house to $20,000, about 5,500 fans, and the Funks and Butcher, since they were all working on a percentage, thought they'd at least finally make a little money from all their efforts. Almost on cue, his son, Ed Jr., who wrestled as Captain Eddie George and still promotes small shows around Lansing, who at the time was getting a major push as all the mistakes in a territory dying were followed, ran into the dressing room in a panic. "I've got terrible news," he screamed. "There's been a robbery at the box office." The formula that made him eventually broke him. But because he did so little when he was on top, age couldn't stop him from being the Sheik and doing the same routine. The hair grew grayer and the forehead became more scar-infested than almost any other in the business history. He had an artificial hip put in years earlier and couldn't leave his feet, or barely even more them. But he kept playing the Sheik long after there was no more money to be made, working tiny independents and high school shows in the area when he and Brazil were well into their 60s in Michigan, Ohio, and in Ontario. Since Whipper Watson was forced into retirement decades earlier due to a car accident, he'd work Ontario usually against either Singh or Whipper Billy Watson Jr., Bill Potts, who had a famous name but none of his father's charisma. Sheik was already in his mid-60s during his final rebirth on a major scale for the FMW promotion in Japan in 1991. His main goal by this time was to make his nephew, who had no wrestling name, into a star and be a marquee name to draw fans in the smaller cities. He could barely walk, but the fans still scattered as he played with fire, as he maintained his scary aura to the end. Sabu, who understood nothing of ring psychology, did every crazy bump in the world while the crowd was mainly focused on his uncle doing nothing. When he'd do the occasional singles match, it would end in a no contest in a minute or less. It was considered one of Atsushi Onita's biggest career wins on January 18, 1993 when he pinned Sheik to win that same U.S. belt that Sheik was shown in all the magazine covers 25 years earlier. And even after that, Sheik and Terry Funk continued to be a major program in Japan stemming from that match more than 15 years earlier. There was fear for a few moments he would die in the ring. There was the famous May 6, 1992 ring surrounded by fire match when he and Sabu faced Onita and Tarzan Goto in Hyogo before a sellout 5,011 fans. The gimmick, which had only been done a few times previously in wrestling, originally thought up in Puerto Rico, went awry. The wind from the outdoor show blew the fire onto the mat, ignited by kerosene that dripped from the cloth surrounding the barbed wire that made up the ropes that were in flames. The ring itself caught on fire and became an inferno in the ring. The other three men rolled under the ropes to safety with minor burns. Sheik, who was immobile, didn't get out fast enough, and suffered third-degree burns. Sheik never spoke to anyone, but wrestlers on the tour privately joked, although they were more than serious, that if Sheik had his way to die, that would have been it in the ring, to the end, in a ball of flames, like the mythical figure he clung on to being. Sheik's career was thought to be finished, but he was actually back in the ring a month later. At the age of 66, he became what is believed to be the oldest recognized world heavyweight champion in pro wrestling history when on June 25, 1992 he won the WWA World Martial Arts Championship from Onita before a sellout of 6,508 fans in Sapporo in a no-rope barbed wire death match. There wasn't much to the match, as Tiger Jeet Singh attacked Onita with his saber and juiced him before the bout even started. Sheik continued the attack with his pencil, but Onita got the pencil. But Sheik won the title in 3:29 using a foreign object and threw 2 fireballs at Onita. He vacated it without doing a job, although in that case it was a planned vacancy to set up the Onita vs. Singh feud for the belt. He still had more glory days ahead. After throwing fire at Terry Funk on a major show a few months earlier, a singles match between the two was the second biggest drawing match on a show headlined by Onita vs. Genichiro Tenryu on May 5, 1994 at Kawasaki Baseball Stadium drew a legitimate sellout of 52,000 fans. And if there was any poetic justice in how his wrestling career ended, he performed on the undercard at the same stadium on May 5, 1995, meeting Mexican wrestler Damien, before 50,000 fans underneath the Onita vs. Hayabusa match. The match only went 147, but the fans loved seeing him and he got a great reaction. The next day, while getting into a taxi that was to take him to Narita Airport, he suffered a massive heart attack. His final appearance at a wrestling show was on December 11, 1998 at Korakuen Hall on a show promoted by Onita, as Sheik finally allowed the Japanese to promote a retirement ceremony for him. By this time, he was unable to walk by himself and needed to be almost carried up the stairs from the dressing room. But the minute he came through the curtain, he was walking strongly, surprising everyone backstage who were scared of what the crowd reaction would be when they saw Sheik unable to walk. He walked around the building, just like always, playing with fire and chasing the fans away, although by this time they were running with smiles on their faces, as opposed to in fear as probably most had done in their childhood. But even to the end, he refused to let anyone see that the ravages of time, age and injuries from 45 years in the ring, just like any opponent, ever got the best of him.